Before Alexander the Great ever took his first breath, the world was waiting for someone extraordinary. The known world of the 4th century before Christ was filled with powerful empires, restless kings, and endless wars. It was a world where ambition and conquest were the only paths to immortality. In the East, the mighty Persian Empire stretched farther than any civilization before it, a colossal kingdom of unimaginable wealth and diversity. Its kings, known as the Great Kings of Persia, ruled over lands that touched the Mediterranean in the west and reached the borders of India in the east. To the Persians, their empire was eternal, its power unshakable. Yet deep within its heart, the fires of rebellion flickered, and beyond its borders, a storm was quietly forming. To the south, the Greek world, once the cradle of art, philosophy, and democracy, had begun to fracture. The glory that Athens had once held during the age of Pericles was fading. Sparta, the warrior state, had grown rigid and tired, a shadow of its former self. Thebes, newly powerful, sought dominance over its neighbors, while smaller city-states like Corinth and Argos maneuvered for survival. Greece was brilliant but divided, a constellation of shining stars that could never agree on a single direction. And then, far to the north, beyond the lands the Greeks dismissed as barbarian and wild, there lay Macedonia, a kingdom of mountain warriors and horsemen. To the refined Greeks, the Macedonians were uncultured hill tribes. They spoke a rough dialect, drank too much wine, and valued strength above philosophy. But under their king, Philip II, Macedonia was changing. Philip was no ordinary monarch. He was cunning, disciplined, and ambitious beyond measure. Having studied the tactics of the Greek hoplites and combined them with the might of Macedonian cavalry, he created a new kind of army, an unstoppable machine of long spears, tight formations, and absolute loyalty. In less than a decade, Philip turned Macedonia from a backwater into a power that terrified the south. His dream was not just to dominate Greece, but to unite it, to make all of Greece follow one banner, his banner. And beyond Greece, his eyes turned eastward, toward the greatest prize of all, the Persian Empire. But fate, it seemed, was preparing an even greater conqueror. In the summer of 356 BC, as Philip campaigned in Thrace, news arrived in the royal capital of Pella that his wife, Olympias, had given birth to a son. The child's birth was accompanied by strange omens. It was said that on the same night, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the wonders of the world, was engulfed in flames. The historian Plutarch later wrote that this was no coincidence, that the goddess herself was too occupied attending the birth of a man who would one day burn down Asia to save her temple. The boy was named Alexander, a name meaning protector of men. From his earliest days, it was clear he was no ordinary child. His mother, Olympias, was not only beautiful but fierce and deeply spiritual. A princess of Epirus, she was a woman of passion and conviction. She was devoted to the gods, especially Zeus, and she told her son from his earliest years that he was not born of Philip, but of Zeus himself, the king of the gods. She whispered to him that lightning had touched her womb in a dream before his birth, a sign that his destiny was divine. Whether Alexander believed every word or not, the seed of greatness was planted deep within him. His father, Philip, was equally determined to shape his son into a ruler. He saw in Alexander a mind sharper than most and a pride that refused to bow. Philip himself had risen through blood and struggle, surviving assassination attempts and betrayal to claim his throne. He had no patience for weakness. Yet when he looked upon his son, he saw something different, not just strength, but brilliance. Once, after watching Alexander tame a horse that no one else could control, Philip turned to his generals and said, "My son, find a kingdom equal to your ambition. Macedonia is too small for you. Alexander's childhood was filled with lessons of war and philosophy, of gods and men. As he grew, his curiosity became insatiable. He questioned everything: the nature of the world, the stars, the meaning of honor. By the age of 13, his father decided he needed a teacher worthy of his potential. And so Philip summoned one of the greatest minds in history, Aristotle, the philosopher from Stagira. Aristotle arrived in Macedonia to educate the young prince. Together, they retreated to a quiet sanctuary in Mieza, a place of calm and reflection surrounded by groves of olive trees and running streams. There, beneath the open sky, Alexander studied philosophy, science, mathematics, politics, and medicine. But most of all, Aristotle taught him the value of knowledge and observation, to look beyond appearances, to question, to reason. Among all his studies, it was literature that captured Alexander's heart. Aristotle introduced him to the epic poetry of Homer, and in the verses of the Iliad, Alexander found his truest inspiration: Achilles, the warrior who chose eternal glory over a long, quiet life. Alexander saw in Achilles not just a hero, but a mirror of himself. From that moment onward, he carried a copy of the Iliad wherever he went, sleeping with it under his pillow beside his dagger. Through Aristotle's teachings, Alexander learned that the Greeks saw themselves as the civilized world, destined to lead others who were, in their eyes, lesser. But he also absorbed deeper lessons about leadership, justice, and curiosity. He learned that a ruler must be both a philosopher and a soldier, a thinker and a conqueror. These teachings would later influence how Alexander treated the people he conquered, sometimes with mercy, sometimes with ruthlessness, but always with vision. As Alexander matured, his nature revealed itself to be a mix of pride, compassion, and ferocity. He adored his mother, but often clashed with his father, whose new marriages and political ambitions created constant tension in the royal household. Olympias warned Alexander that Philip's other wives might bear sons who could challenge his right to the throne. Philip, meanwhile, grew frustrated with his son's confidence and questioning nature. The court of Pella was filled with intrigue and whispering, the perfect forge for a young prince learning to navigate power. Even as a youth, Alexander's ambition was unmistakable. At the age of 16, when Philip went to war in Byzantium, he left Alexander in charge of the kingdom. When a rebellious tribe rose in the north, Alexander personally led the army to crush it, founding a city on the conquered land, Alexandropolis, named, of course, after himself. He was barely more than a boy, yet already he was ruling, commanding, and leaving his mark on the map. His confidence bordered on destiny. Once when a messenger arrived from Athens bringing news of Philip's victories, Alexander reportedly said, "My father will leave me nothing great to do." He hungered for challenge, for glory, for a destiny of his own making. But his defining moment as a youth came with the taming of Bucephalus, the great horse. The animal had been brought before Philip for sale, but it was wild and uncontrollable, throwing every rider who dared mount it. Philip was ready to send it away when Alexander stepped forward. "You will lose a magnificent horse because you do not understand him," he said. Laughter rippled through the court, but Philip allowed his son to try. Alexander turned the horse toward the sun, realizing it was afraid of its own shadow. Gently, he calmed it, mounted it, and rode it across the plain. When he returned, the court fell silent. Philip, filled with pride and awe, embraced his son and declared, "Macedonia is too small for you. Seek a kingdom worthy of your greatness." From that day onward, Bucephalus and Alexander were inseparable. The horse would carry him across rivers, mountains, and deserts, through victories and near-death battles until the end of its life, and when Bucephalus finally died, Alexander would name a city in his honor. As Alexander grew older, stories of his courage spread across the land. He trained daily with his companions, the sons of noble families who would later become his generals. He led hunts, fought in mock battles, and debated philosophy with an intensity that left others astonished. He was both warrior and thinker, proud and restless. But beneath his confidence, he carried the weight of prophecy. His mother had filled him with a sense of divine purpose. His father had taught him to seize destiny through strength, and Aristotle had given him the tools to understand the world. All three influences would collide to create a man unlike any other. By the age of 20, Alexander's path was set. He had already seen his father reform Greece and prepare for war against Persia. He had seen betrayal within his family, the assassination of friends, and the brutality of power. He had learned that greatness demanded sacrifice, and that no empire, however vast, was beyond his reach. He was not yet the conqueror history would remember, but every part of him was ready. The blood of kings, gods, and philosophers flowed through his veins. The restless fire in his heart demanded a larger stage. The world before Alexander had been divided, uncertain, and ruled by fading powers. But with his birth, everything began to change. For the boy born in Pella would grow into a man who reshaped the world map, spread Greek culture across continents, and became a legend whose name would echo through millennia. The age of Alexander the Great was coming, and the world would never be the same again. As the 340s before Christ unfolded, the world began to feel the growing strength of Macedonia. Under King Philip II, the once fragmented northern kingdom had risen to become the dominant power in Greece. City after city bowed to his will, not only through war, but through diplomacy, marriage, and cunning. While Philip reshaped the political map, his young son Alexander was coming of age, absorbing every lesson that would prepare him for greatness. The prince had inherited his father's sharp intellect and his mother's fiery spirit. His days were filled with rigorous training, horse riding, archery, combat drills, and military strategy. Yet Alexander was not content merely to practice the arts of war. He studied the histories of great empires, Egypt, Persia, Assyria, and pondered how each had risen and fallen. What made one civilization dominate another? What made kings immortal? These were not the questions of an ordinary youth. By the age of 16, Alexander's life began to blend theory with reality. Philip, ever ambitious, was campaigning in Byzantium and Thrace, securing Macedonia's northern borders. In his absence, he entrusted his teenage son with command of the kingdom. It was both a test and a statement. For the first time, Alexander would rule, not as a child under guidance, but as regent in full authority. The test came swiftly. A Thracian tribe known as the Maidi rebelled near the Macedonian frontier, believing the king's absence left them free to challenge royal control. But Alexander moved with the decisiveness that would later define his career. He gathered his forces, marched north, and crushed the rebellion with ruthless efficiency. To mark his victory, he founded a new city on the conquered territory, naming it Alexandropolis, the first of many cities that would bear his name. Macedonia had seen a glimpse of the leadership that was coming. When Philip returned, he was proud, but perhaps also wary. He had built an empire through his own strength and cunning. Now he saw that his son possessed something more, a fire that might one day outshine his own. The relationship between father and son grew increasingly complex. Philip admired Alexander's courage and intelligence, yet resented his impatience. Alexander, in turn, idolized his father's achievements, but despised his constant pursuit of new wives and political alliances. Philip's ambitions extended far beyond Macedonia. He envisioned himself as the leader of all Greece, united under his command, ready to march east and conquer the Persian Empire. To achieve this, he reformed every part of Macedonian life. His army became the most disciplined in the world, built around the deadly phalanx, rows of soldiers armed with 18-foot spears called sarissas. The phalanx was nearly invincible when properly commanded, and behind it stood the king's elite cavalry, the companions. Philip also turned politics into a weapon. Through marriage, diplomacy, and bribery, he secured influence over the Greek city-states. When diplomacy failed, he used his army. One by one, the cities that had once defied him fell into line. Some joined willingly, others by force. By 338 BC, Greece was no longer a scattered collection of rivals. It was a continent united, though reluctantly, under Macedonian dominance. For Alexander, this was both triumph and tension. He served as a general in his father X's army and fought alongside him in the most decisive campaign of all, the Battle of Chaeronea. At just 18, Alexander commanded the left wing of the Macedonian army against the Thebans, including their elite unit, the Sacred Band, a group of 300 warriors renowned for their discipline and valor. The battle was fierce, but Alexander led a devastating cavalry charge that broke the Theban line. His actions that day helped secure Macedonia's victory and confirmed Philip's supremacy over Greece. The young prince had tasted real battle for the first time. He had seen the chaos, the blood, and the glory of war. When the fighting ended, he walked among the fallen and saw what ambition demanded: sacrifice, but he also saw how power could be forged from the ashes of destruction. After the victory, Philip established the League of Corinth, a federation of Greek states under his leadership, all pledged to invade Persia as one united force. He was hailed as the champion of Greece, the man who would avenge the Persian invasions of the past. Yet even as the dream of conquering Asia grew closer, tensions within his own household were reaching a breaking point. The royal family of Macedonia was a storm of ambition, jealousy, and intrigue. Olympias, Alexander's mother, had grown bitter as Philip took other wives. The most significant of these was Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman whose marriage to Philip threatened Alexander's position as heir. For the first time, Philip had a Macedonian wife, one who could bear him a pure Macedonian son. At the wedding feast, an intoxicated relative of Cleopatra, Attalus, stood up and loudly prayed that the union would produce a legitimate heir to the throne, implying that Alexander, son of a foreign mother, was not. The words were an open insult. Enraged, Alexander threw his cup at Attalus, shouting that he himself was the true heir. Philip, equally drunk and furious, drew his sword and lunged at his son, but stumbled and fell to the ground. Alexander looked down at his father with cold contempt and said, "See there, the man who would cross from Europe into Asia, yet cannot cross from one couch to another without falling." The court was stunned. Father and son were now divided, and within days Alexander left Macedonia with his mother. Olympias returned to Epirus, while Alexander sought refuge among Philip's allies. For months, the future of the royal family hung in uncertainty, but time and politics forced reconciliation. Philip's dream of invading Persia required stability at home, and Alexander's talent was too great to discard. Eventually, father and son reconciled, though the wounds never truly healed. Philip pressed forward with his plans for war, assembling the largest army Macedonia had ever seen. Envoys were sent across Greece to rally support for the campaign. The dream of conquering Persia was about to begin. Then, suddenly, destiny intervened. In the summer of 336 BC, Macedonia gathered to celebrate the marriage of Philip's daughter, Cleopatra, to the king of Epirus, a grand festival in the city of Aegae. Nobles and soldiers filled the theatre to witness the ceremony. Philip, in his finest armor, entered the arena without bodyguards, proud and confident. The crowd roared its approval. But as he walked between his people, a man stepped forward from the shadows. It was Pausanias, one of Philip's own bodyguards. Without warning, Pausanias drew a dagger and plunged it into the king's chest. Philip staggered, gasped, and fell. The crowd screamed as the assassin fled, but he was quickly cut down by Philip's companions. In an instant, the most powerful man in Greece was dead. The reasons behind the assassination remained shrouded in mystery. Some claimed it was revenge for a personal insult. Others whispered that it was part of a larger plot. Many suspected Olympias's involvement, and perhaps even Alexander's. Whether or not they had a hand in it, both stood to benefit from Philip's death. When news of the assassination spread, chaos threatened to engulf the kingdom. Macedonia's enemies hoped the young prince would falter, but Alexander moved swiftly and decisively. Within days, he was proclaimed king at the age of 20. He inherited not only the throne, but an unfinished empire, a kingdom surrounded by rebellion and distrust. His first acts as king revealed the kind of ruler he would become. He dealt with potential rivals without hesitation. Those who questioned his right to rule were executed. The noble houses loyal to Philip's other wives were purged. In a single stroke, Alexander secured his power and silenced dissent. But he also understood the importance of loyalty. He retained many of his father's generals and advisors, knowing they were experienced men who could guide his early reign. Among them were Parmenion, an old and trusted general, and Antipater, who would later govern Macedonia in his absence. Once his throne was secure, Alexander turned to the Greek states, where news of Philip's death had sparked rebellion. Thebes, Athens, and other cities believed that Macedonia would crumble without Philip's leadership. They misjudged the new king. Alexander led his army south with astonishing speed, appearing before the walls of Thebes before the city even realized he was coming. Terrified, the other Greek states surrendered immediately. Only Thebes resisted. Alexander gave them one chance to submit. They refused. What followed was a warning to the entire Greek world. The city of Thebes was stormed, its walls torn down, its people killed or sold into slavery. It was a brutal act, but it secured Alexander's authority. No other Greek city dared to rise against him. In a matter of months, the young king had done what few men could. He had silenced rebellion, unified Greece, and restored the legacy of his father. The League of Corinth reaffirmed its allegiance to Macedonia and appointed Alexander as its supreme commander, the leader of the united Greek armies. The dream Philip had begun was now Alexander's to fulfill. At 20 years old, he was master of Greece. Before him stretched a world still divided, a Persian empire vast and rich, but decadent and vulnerable. Alexander looked eastward and saw his destiny waiting. The conquest his father had planned would now be his own. The boy who had tamed Bucephalus, the student who had studied under Aristotle, the prince who had faced rebellion and betrayal, all the lessons of his youth had prepared him for this moment. He was no longer just the son of Philip or the child of Olympias. He was the king of Macedonia, the commander of Greece, and soon to be the greatest conqueror the world had ever known. The rise of Alexander the Great had begun. When Philip II fell beneath an assassin's blade, the world believed Macedonia would crumble. His empire had been built through his own brilliance, diplomacy, and ruthless strength. To many, his 20-year-old son seemed too young to inherit so vast and fragile a kingdom. The Greek city-states, long held in check by Philip's iron hand, rejoiced at his death. They whispered that the Macedonian dominion had died with its king. They were wrong. From the very moment the crown touched Alexander's brow, he acted not as a grieving son, but as a ruler born for command. His father's death had left Macedonia in peril. Enemies on all sides, allies uncertain, rebellions brewing. Yet instead of hesitation, Alexander responded with speed and precision. Within days, he summoned the Macedonian nobles, addressed them with calm authority, and demanded loyalty. Those who hesitated were cut down, rivals were executed, pretenders silenced, and potential conspirators eliminated. The message was clear. The throne was not vacant, the bloodline not broken. Alexander ruled. The first challenge came from the north. The Thracian and Illyrian tribes, long subdued by Philip's campaigns, saw an opportunity to reclaim their lands. They underestimated the resolve of the new king. Alexander marched north with the same army that had followed his father, leading them with boldness that astonished even his veteran generals. He drove the Thracians beyond the Haemus Mountains, defeating them in a series of brutal battles. At the river Danube, he faced a coalition of tribes but crushed them utterly, crossing the river to pursue their retreat. Then, turning west, he descended upon the Illyrians, routing their forces in a campaign so swift that news of his victories reached Greece before the smoke of battle had cleared. The speed of his movements became legend. No king, not even Philip, had ever marched so far, so quickly. His soldiers, though weary, began to see that this young man possessed something more than courage. He had destiny in his eyes. When the Illyrians sued for peace, Alexander accepted their submission, restoring Macedonia's northern borders. But even as he secured the frontier, darker news arrived from the south. In Greece, the city of Thebes had risen in rebellion. The Thebans believed the rumors that Alexander had died in the northern wars. Athens, ever restless under Macedonian rule, quietly encouraged them. To the Greeks, it seemed the gods had granted them a second chance to throw off the Macedonian yoke. When word of the revolt reached Alexander, he did not hesitate. He gathered his army and marched south. The distance between Macedonia and Thebes was vast, yet he crossed it in less than 2 weeks. As the sun rose over the plains of Boeotia, the Macedonian army appeared before the walls of Thebes, a sight the city had never expected to see again. The Thebans, shocked and unprepared, suddenly realized the rumors of his death were false. Alexander's arrival sent panic through Greece. The speed of his advance was so extraordinary that many thought it a miracle. Ambassadors from Athens and other cities rushed to pledge loyalty once more, fearing what would come next. But Thebes stood alone in its defiance. Inside the city, factions argued. Some urged surrender, others cried for resistance. Pride won over caution. They rejected Alexander's demands and prepared for war. The siege of Thebes began. Alexander offered them one final chance: lay down their arms, submit, and the city would be spared. The Thebans answered with arrows and taunts. They believed the other Greek states would come to their aid, but no one came. The Macedonian army, disciplined and relentless, surrounded the city on all sides. Siege towers rose, battering rams thundered, and soldiers poured through breaches in the walls. The fighting was merciless. Macedonian phalanxes advanced street by street, their long spears forming an impenetrable wall. The Thebans, renowned for their valor, fought desperately, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. As the battle raged, Alexander's fury burned brighter. He had offered mercy. They had answered with defiance. When the city finally fell, Alexander gave the order that would echo through history. Thebes was to be destroyed. Completely. Its walls were torn down, its houses burned, its people slaughtered or sold into slavery. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, for Alexander revered art even in the midst of vengeance. In a single day, Thebes ceased to exist. The destruction was total, and the message unmistakable. No city, however proud, would ever again doubt the power of Macedonia or the will of its young king. The shock spread across Greece like thunder. Athens, horrified, immediately sent envoys to plead loyalty and peace. Corinth, Argos, Sparta, all bowed in silence. None dared challenge him again. Alexander did not rejoice in the destruction, but he understood its necessity. Thebes had defied him publicly. Mercy now would invite further rebellion. Harshness, though cruel, would ensure peace. And peace was exactly what he needed. He had no desire to waste years subduing Greece. His eyes were fixed far beyond its mountains, on the empire his father had dreamed of conquering. Persia. With Greece now secured, Alexander turned to preparation. He was a man possessed by purpose. The fall of Thebes had given him absolute control over Greece and its armies. The League of Corinth, the alliance of city-states his father had created, reaffirmed its oath of loyalty. Once again, all of Greece, by choice or by fear, followed the Macedonian king. In their council they declared Alexander the hegemon, the supreme commander of the united Greek forces. His mandate was clear: to avenge the Persian invasions of the past and to bring down the empire that had long threatened Greece. But Alexander's ambition was greater than vengeance. To him, Persia was not merely an enemy, it was the ultimate prize. It was the heart of the known world, the seat of immense wealth and power, a land where kings ruled as gods. To conquer Persia was to conquer history itself. He spent months preparing for the campaign. From every corner of his realm he gathered supplies: grain, weapons, horses, armor. Shipbuilders constructed a vast fleet to transport the army across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. Diplomats were sent to secure alliances and intelligence on Persian movements. Macedonia itself was reorganized. Alexander appointed trusted generals to govern in his absence, ensuring stability while he campaigned abroad. Antipater, one of Philip's most seasoned commanders, was left as regent, charged with maintaining order in Greece. To secure the loyalty of his men, Alexander distributed rewards and promotions, promising them riches beyond imagination once Persia fell. In the early spring of 334 BC, his preparations were complete. The army that gathered under his command was unlike any seen before. It numbered around 37,000 men, small compared to the massive Persian forces, but disciplined, seasoned, and fiercely loyal. At its core stood the Macedonian phalanx, a wall of steel that could crush any opposition. Around it were the cavalry, the companions, Alexander's elite guard who fought by his side. There were also archers, engineers, and supply units, the instruments of a professional, unstoppable machine of conquest. Before leaving Macedonia, Alexander made one final visit to the city of Dion, at the foot of Mount Olympus. There, he offered sacrifices to the gods and held grand athletic games in honor of his father. He wanted the people to see that the legacy of Philip lived on, and that the gods themselves favored his cause. From there, he marched to the coast. At the ancient city of Ægæ, he gazed across the waters of the Hellespont, the narrow sea that divided Europe and Asia. On the opposite shore lay the land of Troy, the land of Achilles, his childhood hero. The connection between myth and destiny was not lost on him. He believed he was about to step into the pages of legend. As the army prepared to cross, Alexander took a single ship ahead of the rest. He carried with him a spear and his armor, gifts from his father. When the ship reached the Asian shore, he leapt onto the sand and thrust his spear into the ground, declaring that he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods. His soldiers cheered. The crossing of the Hellespont marked not only the beginning of a campaign, but the birth of an empire. Before marching inland, Alexander made a pilgrimage to the ruins of Troy. He laid a wreath upon the tomb of Achilles, honoring the hero he had idolized since childhood. There, among the ancient stones and windswept plains, he felt the presence of destiny. He saw himself as a continuation of that heroic age, not merely a conqueror of nations, but a seeker of eternal glory. Behind him, Europe was silent and united. Greece was subdued, Macedonia secure. Before him stretched the vast empire of Persia, a realm of unimaginable riches and power ruled by King Darius III. Few believed Alexander could defeat such a force, but those who knew him, those who had followed him through the mountains and rivers of the north, who had seen him destroy Thebes and unite Greece, believed otherwise. Alexander himself harbored no doubt. He was 22 years old, yet he carried himself with the confidence of a man chosen by fate. Every victory, every hardship, every lesson from Aristotle and Philip had led to this moment. He was ready. The world he was about to enter was older, grander, and far more complex than his own. Persia had stood for centuries as the center of civilization. Its kings ruled from palaces of gold and marble, commanding armies from Egypt to India. Yet Alexander saw not an empire, but a challenge, a giant ready to fall. As his army marched eastward into Asia Minor, Alexander looked back one final time at the western horizon. Behind him lay his homeland, his mother, his people, everything familiar. Ahead lay the unknown. But he smiled, for in his heart he knew that his destiny was not in Macedonia or Greece, but across the lands he was about to conquer. The consolidation of power was complete. The rebellions were crushed, Greece was silent, and the Macedonian army stood ready. The age of conquest had begun. When Alexander crossed the narrow waters of the Hellespont, he was not merely leaving Europe, he was leaving behind the world he had known. The winds from the Aegean carried the smell of salt and legend, whispering tales of heroes who had once walked the same shores. As his ships cut through the waves toward Asia, Alexander stood at the prow, gazing eastward toward a land he intended to make his own. On the opposite side of the strait rose the plains of ancient Troy. For Alexander, this crossing was not the start of a campaign. It was the continuation of a destiny foretold. He was 22 years old, commanding one of the most formidable armies ever assembled, and behind him lay a unified Greece, conquered and silent. Ahead stretched the Persian Empire, a world of unimaginable riches, vast cities and mighty kings. The odds were impossible, but Alexander never believed in odds. When his feet touched the Asian shore, he leapt from his ship, drove his spear into the ground, and declared that he accepted the continent as a gift from the gods. It was both an act of symbolism and prophecy. The Macedonians cheered, believing their king was favored by divine power. Before marching inland, Alexander made his way to the ruins of Troy. There, among the crumbling walls and ancient tombs, he laid a wreath upon the grave of Achilles, the hero whose spirit he sought to emulate. He offered sacrifices to the gods and prayed for the same glory that Achilles had achieved. As he left Troy, he carried with him a shield said to have belonged to the legendary warrior, a relic he would bear into battle for years to come. The first challenge of the campaign came swiftly. Word of the Macedonian crossing reached the Persian satraps, the governors of Asia Minor. They were shocked by Alexander's audacity. How could a small army from distant Macedonia dare to invade the empire of Darius, ruler of the world? Yet underestimating Alexander would prove fatal. The Persian satraps gathered their forces near the river Granicus, determined to crush the invaders before they could move deeper into Asia. The battle that followed would be the first great test of Alexander's genius. The Macedonian army approached the Granicus in late spring. On the opposite bank, the Persians waited, their cavalry lined up along the river, their infantry behind them. The Persians believed the river's swift current and steep banks would prevent a direct assault. Alexander saw only an opportunity. He surveyed the field, then ordered his men to form up. The Macedonian phalanx spread across the riverbank, while the cavalry, Alexander's chosen companions, prepared to charge. At sunset, with the water glittering beneath them, Alexander led the attack. He spurred his horse forward, plunging into the river with his men. Arrows and javelins rained down, but the Macedonians pressed on. The Persians were taken aback by the sheer ferocity of the assault. As the two forces clashed, the sound of metal on metal echoed across the valley. Alexander, easily recognizable by the tall white plume on his helmet, fought at the front. He met the Persian nobles in personal combat, cutting them down one after another. At one moment, a Persian commander swung a blade at his head. But Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's closest companions, struck the attacker down just in time. The battle raged fiercely, but the discipline of the Macedonian phalanx and the leadership of their king turned the tide. When the dust settled, thousands of Persians lay dead. The Macedonians had won their first victory on Asian soil. The Persian governors fled, leaving behind their treasures and the lands they had once ruled. The path into Asia Minor was open. The Battle of Granicus was more than a military triumph. It was a declaration. The Persians now understood that Alexander was not a mere raider, he was a conqueror. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, long oppressed under Persian control, greeted him as a liberator. Ephesus, Miletus, and Sardis opened their gates without resistance. Alexander restored their democracies, abolished Persian tribute, and promised freedom in the name of Greece. Yet his mercy was not without purpose. By sparing these cities, he secured their loyalty and supplies for the coming campaign. His soldiers began to believe that their mission was not just conquest, but destiny, the unification of East and West under a single rule. As Alexander advanced deeper into Asia Minor, he encountered pockets of resistance. At Halicarnassus, a powerful city fortified by Persian forces, he faced his first siege. The defenders, commanded by the mercenary general Memnon of Rhodes, fought fiercely, using the city's walls and harbors to their advantage. For weeks, the Macedonians battered the defenses with siege towers and catapults, while the Persians launched daring counterattacks. In one such attack, the Persians set fire to Alexander's siege engines, but he quickly regrouped and pressed the assault until the defenders were forced to flee by sea. The city fell, and Asia Minor lay open before him. For the next 2 years, Alexander moved along the western coast of Anatolia, liberating city after city, driving out Persian satraps, and winning the loyalty of the Greek world in Asia. But while his victories multiplied, the true challenge was still ahead. The great King Darius III had finally realized the magnitude of the threat. He gathered a vast army from every corner of his empire, from Babylon, Egypt, Syria, and the East, an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands. Darius himself would now lead it. The confrontation came in the autumn of 333 BC, near the narrow plain of Issus, where the mountains met the sea. Alexander's army, though vastly outnumbered, was driven by confidence and discipline. Darius positioned his forces on the plain, his center guarded by elite Persian troops, his flanks stretching as far as the eye could see. Behind them, the royal chariot of Darius gleamed in the sun, a symbol of Persian majesty. Alexander arranged his forces carefully. His right flank, where he himself would lead the companions, faced the Persian left. His phalanx formed the center, their long spears bristling like a wall of iron. When the signal was given, Alexander rode forward, leading a furious cavalry charge. The Macedonian line smashed into the Persian ranks, driving them backward toward the sea. The fighting was intense and chaotic. Arrows darkened the sky, horses screamed, and the river turned red with blood. Darius, watching from his chariot, saw his left flank collapsing under Alexander's assault. As panic spread, the great king lost his nerve. Abandoning his chariot, he fled the field, leaving behind his family, his treasure, and his royal banner. The Persian army, seeing their king flee, broke apart. The Macedonians pursued them relentlessly, cutting down thousands. When the dust settled, the Battle of Issus was over, and the world had changed forever. Alexander now stood as the master of Asia Minor. The royal family of Persia, Darius's mother, wife, and children were taken captive, but Alexander treated them with unexpected respect, refusing to harm them and assuring them that Darius had lost only his empire, not his honor. His gesture shocked the world and earned him admiration even among his enemies. After Issus, Alexander turned south. He marched along the eastern Mediterranean coast, securing cities and ports to cut off the Persian navy. One by one, the Phoenician cities surrendered, except for Tyre, the proud island fortress that had resisted conquerors for centuries. Tyre's walls rose from the sea itself, surrounded by deep waters. The city's rulers refused to allow Alexander entry, believing their island was impregnable. But Alexander was not a man who accepted defiance. He resolved to take Tyre, no matter the cost. For 7 long months he besieged the city. He ordered the construction of a massive causeway stretching from the mainland to the island, a feat of engineering unmatched in the ancient world. The Tyrians fought back fiercely, using ships to burn his siege towers and launching attacks on his workers. Yet Alexander rebuilt every time, relentless and unyielding. When the causeway was complete, his siege engines pounded the city's walls day and night. Finally, when a breach appeared, Alexander led the assault himself. Macedonian soldiers poured through the opening, clashing with the defenders in brutal combat. The streets of Tyre ran with blood. When victory came, Alexander's fury was absolute. The city was sacked, its men killed or enslaved, its survivors scattered. The destruction of Tyre sent shockwaves through the ancient world. No fortress was beyond his reach. From Tyre, Alexander marched south into Egypt. The Egyptians, long weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. They saw in him not a conqueror, but a deliverer sent by the gods. When he entered Memphis, he was crowned Pharaoh, the living god-king of Egypt. The priests declared him the son of Amun, the Egyptian deity of creation, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus. During his time in Egypt, Alexander's ambitions expanded beyond conquest. He envisioned a new city, one that would serve as a bridge between East and West, between Greece and Egypt, between mortal men and immortality. On the northern coast, near the mouth of the Nile, he marked the site with his own hands. This city would be called Alexandria. Its streets would be wide and straight, its harbour vast, its culture a blend of Greek and Egyptian wisdom. It would stand as a symbol of unity, trade, and learning. And indeed, long after Alexander's death, Alexandria would become one of the greatest cities in history. But even as the foundations were laid, Alexander's eyes turned once more to the east. Darius had escaped Issus and was gathering yet another army, even greater than before. The great king refused to surrender, and Alexander would not rest until Persia itself had fallen. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander journeyed deep into the desert to the oracle of Siwa. There, in the silence of endless sands, he sought confirmation of his divine destiny. The priests greeted him as the son of Zeus Ammon. When he emerged from the temple, his men noticed a change in him. He spoke less as a mortal king and more as a man convinced of divine purpose. Whether the oracle had truly declared him a god or not, Alexander believed it. With Egypt secure and his empire expanding, he marched once more toward Asia. Behind him lay the ruins of Tyre and the promise of Alexandria. Ahead awaited Darius, the king who still dared to defy him. The conquest of Asia had only begun, but already Alexander had reshaped the ancient world. From the waters of the Hellespont to the sands of the Nile, his name had become legend. He was no longer simply a Macedonian king. He was the master of 2 continents, the bridge between myth and history. Yet his ambition still burned. Persia, the greatest empire of all, remained unconquered, and Alexander would not stop until the world itself bowed before him. The winds of destiny carried Alexander eastward once more. From the shining temples of Egypt to the rugged mountains of Mesopotamia, his march had become something greater than conquest. It was a transformation of the ancient world. Every city he passed fell under his banner. Every ruler who defied him was crushed or made his ally. Yet one man still stood between Alexander and dominion over Asia, Darius III, King of Kings, ruler of the Persian Empire. For 2 years since Issus, Darius had been rebuilding his strength. He had gathered new armies from the farthest reaches of his empire, from the mountains of Armenia, the deserts of Arabia, the plains of Mesopotamia, and the steppes of Central Asia. He would meet Alexander again. this time not as a fleeing king, but as a commander ready to defend his throne. The place of their final confrontation would be the vast plain of Gaugamela, near the Tigris River. A flat, open expanse, chosen by Darius himself to give full advantage to his massive army and its war chariots. He ordered the ground leveled and cleared, so that his chariots could move freely. It was a field prepared for the destruction of Alexander's smaller force, or so Darius believed. Alexander knew that the battle ahead would decide the fate of empires. He spent the night before the fight calmly, sleeping soundly while his generals fretted. When dawn broke on that fateful day of October 331 BC, the Macedonian army formed up for war. 30,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, against an enemy perhaps 5 times their number. The Persians stretched across the horizon, their banners gleaming in the sun. In the center stood Darius, upon a high chariot of gold, surrounded by his royal guard and the best troops of the empire. As the armies faced each other, silence fell, the tense stillness before the storm. Then, with a single signal from Alexander, the Macedonian drums thundered, and the lines began to move. The phalanx advanced like a living wall, its spears glinting like waves under the morning light. On the right, Alexander led the companion cavalry in a daring advance, seeking the opening that would decide the day. Darius ordered his chariots forward. The thunder of hooves and the screech of wheels filled the air as they charged, their blades flashing from the axles meant to tear through flesh and bone. But Alexander's soldiers had trained for this moment. As the chariots neared, the Macedonians opened their ranks, letting the deadly machines pass harmlessly through before closing in again and cutting down their riders. The Persian advantage dissolved in moments. Then Alexander saw his chance. Darius had stretched his left flank too far in an attempt to envelop the Macedonian line. With precise timing, Alexander wheeled his cavalry toward the gap that had opened between the Persian center and left. Like a bolt of lightning, he struck directly at the heart of the Persian army, straight toward the chariot of the great king himself. Panic swept through the Persian ranks. Darius, seeing Alexander bearing down upon him, lost his nerve once more. Fear overcame royal dignity. He turned his chariot and fled the field, his guards scattering in confusion. The sight of their king fleeing broke the spirit of the Persian army. What began as an ordered battle dissolved into chaos. The Macedonians pursued relentlessly, cutting down thousands. When the dust settled over the plains of Gaugamela, the Persian Empire lay shattered. Darius's army was destroyed, his power broken. Alexander, now the undisputed master of Asia, had achieved what no Greek had ever dreamed possible. He had conquered the mightiest empire the world had known. But Alexander was not satisfied with victory alone. He would not rest until Darius himself was in his hands. For months he pursued the fleeing king across the vast territories of Persia. Through deserts and mountain passes, he followed the trail of the defeated monarch. Cities opened their gates before him. Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia, surrendered without resistance. When Alexander entered Babylon, he did so not as a destroyer, but as a ruler. The people lined the streets to greet him, showering him with flowers and songs. He marveled at the city's splendor, its towering walls, its hanging gardens, its temples rising to the heavens. Standing before the great ziggurat of Marduk, Alexander made offerings to the Babylonian gods, showing respect to their traditions. He understood that to rule such vast lands, he must become not just a conqueror, but a king of all peoples. From Babylon, he marched east to Susa, another of Persia's royal capitals. There he found treasures beyond imagination, gold and silver piled high in endless vaults, riches gathered from centuries of empire. He sent much of it back to Greece and Macedonia, rewarding his soldiers and financing the continuation of his campaign. But the true symbol of Persian power lay still farther to the east, Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, the heart of the empire, and the seat of its ancient kings. To reach it, Alexander had to cross the Zagros Mountains, braving treacherous passes and fierce resistance. When he finally descended upon Persepolis, he found the city vast and glittering, its palaces adorned with sculptures and gold. As he entered the Hall of 100 Columns, Alexander looked upon the throne of the great king, the very seat once occupied by Darius, Xerxes, and Cyrus the Great. In that moment, the boy who had once dreamed in Pella of world conquest stood at the center of history, master of all he surveyed. Yet victory brought not peace, but conflict within his own heart. For as he walked among the treasures and symbols of Persian greatness, Alexander began to sense the weight of what he had become. He was no longer merely the avenger of Greece. He was the heir to the Persian kings. The question now was not how to conquer, but how to rule. That night Persepolis burned. The reasons for the fire remained debated through the ages. Some say it was an act of drunken celebration. Others, a deliberate vengeance for Persia's invasion of Greece a century earlier. The flames consumed the palaces, lighting the night sky for miles. Alexander watched in silence as the city that symbolized Persian majesty turned to ash. Some say he wept when he realized the magnitude of what he had destroyed, that in erasing Persia's glory, he had also destroyed a part of the world's soul. Meanwhile, Darius fled ever eastward, pursued by Alexander's generals, but his flight was doomed. His own satraps, fearing the wrath of their conqueror, turned against him. In a desolate valley of Bactria, they struck him down and left him dying in the dust. When Alexander reached the scene, the great king was already dead. The conqueror stood over the fallen ruler of Asia, and in that moment, something changed within him. He covered Darius's body with his own cloak and wept. "He was a great king," he said quietly, "and he met a king's end." He ordered Darius given a royal burial, as befits a monarch, and sent word throughout the empire that the lineage of the Persian kings would continue. In him, the death of Darius marked the end of the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander was now the undisputed ruler of the known world, stretching from Greece to India, from the Nile to the mountains of Central Asia. Yet even as his power reached its zenith, his transformation from conqueror to emperor began. He adopted Persian dress and customs, married into the royal family, and demanded that his subjects bow before him in the Persian manner. To his Macedonian companions, this was troubling. They had followed him to avenge Greece, not to see their king become a Persian god. Whispers of unease began to spread among his men, but Alexander saw further than they did. He dreamed not of a Greek empire ruling over barbarians, but of a new world, one where East and West would blend, where Greek and Persian, Macedonian and Egyptian would stand as equals under one crown. To achieve this, he knew he had to embody both conqueror and ruler, hero and god. In Babylon and Susa, he reorganized administration, appointing both Macedonian and Persian governors. He trained Persian youth in Macedonian tactics, forming a new army of mixed heritage. He began to style himself not just as King of Macedonia, but as King of Kings, the title once held by Darius. To his Greek followers it seemed hubris. To his Persian subjects it was divine justice. The weight of empire began to show. The young general who had once shared wine and laughter with his soldiers now walked among courtiers and priests, his manner more solemn, his eyes more distant. The fire of conquest had given way to the burden of rule. Yet even as an emperor, Alexander remained restless. He could not stop moving, could not stop seeking new horizons. The edge of the map called to him. From Persepolis, he pushed deeper into the east, subduing the rebellious provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana. The terrain was harsh, the resistance fierce. Guerrilla warfare dragged on for years. Alexander married Roxana, a local noblewoman, hoping to unite Macedonian and Persian bloodlines. But even love could not soften his growing obsession with absolute power. He founded new cities across his empire, each bearing his name. Alexandria scattered like stars from Egypt to India. In each he planted the seeds of Greek culture, ensuring that his influence would outlast his life. The philosopher Aristotle had once taught him that a true ruler leaves behind not only monuments, but ideas. Alexander had taken that lesson to heart. As he traveled farther into Asia, his armies grew weary. They had been fighting for nearly a decade. Many longed to return home, to see Macedonia again. Yet Alexander drove them forward, consumed by a vision of total dominion. He believed that beyond the next mountain lay the edge of the world, and that his name must be written there. But for now, the conquest of Persia was complete. The empire of Cyrus the Great, which had ruled for centuries, had fallen to a single man. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis now bowed to him. From the ashes of Persia rose a new world, one forged by Alexander's will. The young prince, who had once ridden out from Macedonia seeking glory, had become something far greater, and perhaps far more dangerous. He was now a ruler of nations, a god among men, a living symbol of unity and ambition. Yet in the shadows of his triumphs, doubt began to stir, among his men, among his generals, and perhaps deep within his own heart. The world had been conquered, but the man who had conquered it was beginning to lose himself within it. The empire of Persia had fallen, yet Alexander's eyes still turned eastward. For most kings, the conquest of such a vast realm would have been enough. But Alexander was not like other kings. The maps of his world ended where his curiosity began. Beyond Persia lay lands spoken of only in myth, mountains without end, strange peoples, and rivers that glowed like liquid fire in the sunset. For Alexander, these were not rumors to be ignored. They were invitations. He marched from Persepolis through the mountains of modern Iran, pressing into the highlands of Bactria and Sogdiana, regions fierce and unyielding, where Persian power had always been weakest. The rugged terrain offered no easy victories. Here, in the shadow of the Hindu Kush, Alexander faced enemies who fought not for empire, but for survival. These were tribes that knew no king, warriors who melted into the mountains, striking and vanishing like ghosts. They did not stand in open battle, but used ambush and deception. Alexander, used to decisive encounters, was forced to adapt. He divided his forces into smaller units, built fortresses, and pursued the rebels through deserts and snow. It was a war without glory, grinding, endless, and cruel. Yet, even amid hardship, Alexander's legend deepened. He led every assault himself, climbing cliffs with his soldiers, sharing their hunger and cold. More than once he was wounded, by arrow, by sword, but he pressed on, his endurance becoming as famous as his courage. The men whispered that no weapon could kill him, that he was protected by gods. It was during this campaign that he met Roxana, the daughter of a local nobleman in Bactria. She was young, beautiful, and strong-willed, unlike the courtly women of Greece or Persia. Accounts differ on their meeting. Some say she was captured after a siege and brought before him, others that he saw her dancing during a victory feast and fell in love instantly. Whatever the truth, Alexander married her soon after, an act that shocked his Macedonian companions. To them, she was a barbarian, unworthy of their king, but Alexander saw more than beauty. He saw a bridge between worlds. By wedding Roxana, he sought to bind East and West, to make his empire more than a conquest. The marriage was both a gesture of love and a declaration of vision. His men toasted it uneasily, unaware that this union would mark the beginning of his transformation from conqueror to emperor of many nations. Even as he celebrated, the restlessness in him returned. Reports came from the farthest reaches of his new realm, lands beyond the mountains, where mighty rivers flowed and vast kingdoms ruled by elephant-riding kings awaited. These were the lands of India, mysterious and immense, To Alexander, India was the edge of the world, the final frontier where he would prove his divinity or perish. In 327 BC, he set out once more, leading his army over the towering passes of the Hindu Kush. The march was brutal. Snow blinded the soldiers. Icy winds froze their armor. Pack animals died by the hundreds. Men slipped into ravines never to be seen again. But Alexander pressed on, urging his men with promises of glory and riches greater than any they had yet known. When they finally descended into the valleys beyond the mountains, the air was thick with heat, and the land before them seemed like another planet, lush, green, and endless. The Indian campaign began with swift victories. The local rulers, astonished by the sudden arrival of the Macedonians, either surrendered or fought in vain. City after city fell. Yet as the army advanced toward the Punjab, resistance stiffened. The most powerful ruler in the region, King Porus of the Paurava kingdom, refused to bow. He gathered his forces on the banks of the Hydaspes River, what we now call the Jhelum, and prepared to confront the invader. The Battle of Hydaspes would become one of Alexander's greatest and most perilous encounters. It was early summer of 326 BC. The monsoon rains had swollen the river into a raging torrent. Porus stationed his army on the far side, confident that no one could cross under such conditions. His forces were vast: infantry, chariots, cavalry, and war elephants, towering beasts whose trumpets echoed through the valley. To Alexander's men, who had never seen elephants before, they seemed like living mountains. For days, the two armies faced each other across the water, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Alexander studied the currents, the terrain, and the enemy's formation. Then, one night during a thunderstorm, he made his move. Under cover of darkness and rain, he led a selected force upstream, silently crossing the river at a narrow point. Lightning split the sky as the Macedonians struggled through the torrent, clinging to their shields and horses. When dawn broke, they had reached the far bank. Porus, realizing too late that he had been outmaneuvered, rushed his army to meet them. The battle that followed was ferocious beyond imagination. The elephants charged first, their tusks fitted with iron blades, trampling soldiers beneath their feet. The Macedonian phalanx bent but did not break. Spears pierced the elephants' hides. Archers targeted their riders. Chaos reigned as beasts turned wild, crushing friend and foe alike. Meanwhile, Alexander and his cavalry swept around the enemy's flank, striking with precision. He met Porus in personal combat, and though both fought bravely, legend says that Porus's valor impressed even his enemy. By noon, the Indian army was shattered, the riverbanks littered with the dead. Porus, wounded and exhausted, was captured and brought before Alexander. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander smiled and granted his wish. In admiration of his courage, he restored Porus to his throne, making him a trusted ally and governor of the conquered lands. It was a moment that revealed both Alexander's pride and his sense of honor. He sought not to humiliate great men, but to make them part of his vision. The Battle of Hydaspes marked the easternmost point of Alexander's conquests. The victory was complete, yet it came at a heavy cost. Many of his soldiers had died. Many more were weary and homesick. The monsoon rains turned the land to mud. Diseases spread, and the endless jungles sapped their strength. Still, Alexander dreamed of marching further, toward the fabled river Ganges and beyond, to the end of the world. But his army had reached its limit. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, Alexander assembled his troops. He spoke to them with passion, urging them to follow him into new conquests, to march beyond where any mortal had gone. He promised them eternal fame. Yet for the first time, his words failed. The men stood silent. They had followed him for 8 long years, from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to India. They had endured every hardship imaginable. Now they wanted to go home. For days, Alexander tried to persuade them, but the resolve of the soldiers was iron. They refused to cross the river. It was not rebellion born of hatred, but of exhaustion. They loved their king, but they were human, and humans have limits. At last, Alexander relented. He wept in his tent, raging at fate, then accepted the will of his army. Standing before his men, he declared that the gods had spoken through their silence. If they would not go farther, they would return, but they would return as conquerors, not deserters. The decision marked the end of his eastward expansion. The edge of the known world had been reached. Before turning back, Alexander erected 12 great altars on the banks of the Hyphasis, dedicating them to the gods of Greece and to his own divine destiny. They stood as monuments to the farthest reach of human ambition. Then, reluctantly, he ordered the retreat. The journey home was as perilous as any battle. Instead of retracing their steps through the mountains, Alexander chose to lead part of his army down the Indus River and across the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most unforgiving regions on earth. It was a decision that would test them beyond endurance. The march through the desert became a nightmare. The sun scorched the earth, sandstorms buried supplies, water was scarce. Men collapsed from thirst, their armor burning against their skin. Horses died by the thousands. Yet Alexander marched on, refusing to take more water than his soldiers. When one of his men brought him a helmet filled with a precious drink, Alexander poured it onto the sand before their eyes, saying, "If my men cannot drink, neither shall I." His act rekindled their spirit, and they followed him still. After months of suffering, they finally reached safety. The survivors emerged gaunt and scarred, but their loyalty to their king was unbroken. They had walked through death and followed him into eternity. By 324 BC, Alexander returned to Susa, the Persian capital, where he began rebuilding his empire's strength. But something in him had changed. The years of endless campaigning had carved away the young warrior's simplicity, replacing it with something heavier, a godlike grandeur that made him seem both magnificent and distant. He staged grand ceremonies, marrying Roxana again in Persian style, and arranging the marriages of thousands of his officers to Persian women, hoping to fuse the two worlds forever. To some, it was a brilliant vision of unity. To others, it was the act of a man who no longer belonged to either culture. The march east had tested not only the limits of geography, but the limits of humanity. Alexander had seen the edge of the world and returned, yet peace eluded him. His empire stretched farther than any before, but within him burned a restlessness that no victory could satisfy. He had conquered everything except the desire to conquer more. The long road of conquest had finally led Alexander home, or at least as close to home as he would ever come again. It was the spring of 324 BC when he and his weary army reached the grand city of Susa. 8 years had passed since they had first crossed into Asia. In those 8 years, they had marched more than 20,000 miles, fought countless battles, and built an empire stretching from the shores of Greece to the valleys of India. But the man who returned was no longer the same as the youth who had once tamed Bucephalus in the palace courtyard of Pella. The fire still burned in his eyes, but it was colder now, tempered by loss, by endless wars, and by the burden of divinity that he had begun to wear like a crown of lead. In Susa, Alexander sought not rest, but renewal. His dream of a united empire, Greek and Persian, East and West, had not faded. He arranged a grand ceremony known to history as the Susa Weddings, a vision of cultural fusion unlike anything the world had ever seen. Before an assembly of nobles and soldiers, he married Roxana once again, this time according to Persian customs. But he was not alone. To symbolize the unity of his people, he commanded that over 10,000 Macedonian officers and soldiers also marry Persian women. For Alexander, it was more than a spectacle. It was policy, a living embodiment of his vision. Yet, among his men, resentment simmered. The old Macedonian veterans grumbled that their king had gone too far, that he had forgotten who he was. They saw him dressing in Persian robes, sitting on a golden throne, demanding divine honors. They had followed him through hell and victory alike, but they could not follow him into worship. Still, Alexander's energy seemed boundless. He reformed the administration, rewarded his loyal generals, and began planning his next great campaign, a march into Arabia, a conquest that would complete his dominion over the known world. But even as he plotted new adventures, fate was quietly closing in. In the summer of 324 BC, tragedy struck. One of Alexander's dearest friends and generals, Hephaestion, fell ill. For years, Hephaestion had been his companion, his confidant, and some say his other self. Together they had shared triumphs and perils, and to Alexander he was more than a brother. When Hephaestion died suddenly, struck by fever in the city of Ecbatana, Alexander was inconsolable. The mighty conqueror, who had faced armies without fear, now wept uncontrollably. He refused food and drink, lay beside the body for days, and ordered immense honors for his fallen friend. He commanded that a funeral pyre of unimaginable scale be built in Babylon, adorned with gold, statues, and sacred offerings. Throughout the empire, temples were dedicated to Hephaestion's spirit. Alexander even demanded that he be worshipped as a god. Those close to him began to whisper that grief had driven their king to madness. From that day forward, something in him darkened. He became moody, suspicious, and restless. The joy that had once driven his ambition was replaced by a desperate desire to outrun mortality itself. Perhaps he knew deep within that his own time was nearing its end. By early 323 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon, the beating heart of his empire. The city glittered like no other. Its vast walls, hanging gardens, and mighty palaces reflected the wealth of the known world. Here, Alexander intended to make Babylon his capital, the seat of a new global order. He envisioned roads that would connect the edges of his empire, fleets that would sail from the Persian Gulf to the Arabian coast, and colonies that would spread Greek knowledge across Asia. The conquest of the world was complete, but the building of civilization had just begun. As preparations for the Arabian expedition continued, omens began to appear, dark, troubling signs that many took as warnings from the gods. One day, a crown blew from Alexander's head and fell into the river. Another time, a sacred animal was found lying dead in the palace. The priests and seers grew uneasy, but Alexander dismissed their fears. He had defied gods before. Why should he fear them now? Then in early June of 323 BC, as Babylon baked under the summer sun, Alexander attended a banquet in honor of one of his admirals, Nearchus. There was wine, music, and laughter, an echo of the old days when the young king celebrated victory after victory. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say he drank too deeply, others that he was struck by fever after bathing in the Euphrates. But what is certain is that within a few hours, Alexander's strength began to fail. His body burned with heat, his voice grew hoarse. At first, his companions believed it a passing illness. After all, their king had survived worse, but the fever did not break. Day by day, it grew worse. Even in sickness, Alexander continued to command. From his bed, he gave orders for the upcoming Arabian campaign. His generals came and went bowing before him, pretending to believe he would recover. But as the days passed, hope faded. For 11 days, the greatest conqueror in history lay helpless in his bed, unable to speak. His army, encamped outside the palace, waited in silence. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said he had been poisoned, others that the gods were taking back what they had given. When the news reached the soldiers that their king was dying, they demanded to see him one last time. The royal guards hesitated, but Alexander, too weak to speak, nodded in assent. One by one, thousands of soldiers filed past his bed. He could no longer raise his voice, but he lifted his hand, greeting them with a faint smile. They wept openly, reaching out to touch the hands and armor of the man who had led them to the ends of the earth. For many, it was the most painful moment of their lives. And then, on the 10th or 11th day of June, 323 BC, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar at Babylon, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. The world seemed to stop. The man who had believed himself invincible, who had never known defeat, was gone. No one knew what to do. The empire stretched from Greece to India, but without its guiding hand, it trembled like a body without a heart. In the silence that followed his death, one question consumed everyone: who would rule in his place? Alexander had no clear heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but had not yet given birth. His half-brother Aridaeus was weak-minded and unfit to lead. As the generals gathered to decide the future, arguments turned into fury, and fury into bloodshed. The empire Alexander had built began to fracture before his body had even grown cold. The soldiers wept as they carried his coffin. His body, preserved in honey and encased in a golden sarcophagus, was meant to be sent to Macedonia, but it never arrived. Somewhere along the journey, the funeral procession was intercepted, and the body taken to Egypt by Ptolemy, one of his generals. There, in the new city of Alexandria, the conqueror who had founded it was laid to rest. His tomb became a shrine, a symbol of greatness and mystery that would endure for centuries. But Alexander's empire could not survive his death. His generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors, turned on one another, carving his realm into kingdoms of their own. Ptolemy ruled in Egypt, Seleucus in Asia, Antigonus and Lysimachus in Greece and Anatolia. What had been one vast empire became a patchwork of rival dynasties, each claiming to carry the torch of Alexander's glory. And yet, even as his empire crumbled, his legend only grew. To the Greeks, he was a hero like Achilles, touched by the gods. To the Persians and Indians, he was both conqueror and liberator. Centuries later, his name would still inspire emperors, generals, and dreamers. Alexander had achieved what no one before him dared to imagine. In a single decade, he had reshaped the known world. He had spread Greek language and culture across 3 continents, founded more than 70 cities, and set in motion the exchange of ideas that would define the Hellenistic age. But his legacy was more than conquest. It was the idea that the world could be united, not by force alone, but by vision, by the blending of cultures, by the belief that humanity, for all its differences, shared a common destiny. His death marked the end of an age, yet his shadow stretched far into the future. Every great conqueror who came after him, Caesar, Napoleon, and countless others, measured themselves against the ghost of a man who had lived barely more than 3 decades. He had crossed every boundary, defied every limit, and reached the very edge of the world. But in the end, even Alexander could not conquer time, and so his story closes, not with defeat, but with transformation. From mortal to legend, from man to myth, his empire fell, but his name endured. And across the centuries, whenever humanity has dreamed of greatness, of reaching beyond what is known, the spirit of Alexander the Great has stirred again, eternal, restless, and unforgotten. When Alexander the Great drew his last breath in Babylon, the ancient world stood at a crossroads. The empire he had built crumbled almost as quickly as it had risen, torn apart by the ambitions of his generals. Yet even as his political creation dissolved, something far greater began to take root, a transformation that would reshape civilization for centuries. From the ashes of his empire rose what historians now call the Hellenistic world, a fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures that spread across 3 continents. Though Alexander's body was gone, his vision lived on in the cities he had founded, the languages he had united, and the ideas he had set in motion. His death was not an ending, but the beginning of an era that bore his spirit in every stone, statue, and word. In the years following his death, his generals divided his empire among themselves. Ptolemy took Egypt, founding a dynasty that would rule for nearly 300 years, ending only with the death of Cleopatra. Seleucus claimed the vast eastern lands of Persia and Mesopotamia. Antigonus and Cassander fought for Greece and Macedonia. They battled for decades, but none could claim to be Alexander's true heir. And yet, all of them carried pieces of his dream. Across their territories, Greek became the language of learning, commerce, and government. Philosophers, artists, and scientists traveled freely between lands that had once been enemies. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in Syria, and Pergamon in Asia Minor became centers of knowledge and art, where Greek ideals mingled with Persian wisdom, Egyptian mysticism, and Indian philosophy. The city of Alexandria, above all, embodied his legacy. Founded by Alexander himself upon the shores of the Mediterranean, it grew into the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Its great library of Alexandria held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the collected knowledge of mankind. Scholars from every corner of the known world came there to study mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. The blending of cultures that Alexander had dreamed of found its greatest expression in this single city, where Greek rationalism met Eastern spirituality and African tradition. Art, too, changed forever. The rigid, idealized forms of classical Greece gave way to a new style, emotional, dynamic, and human. Statues no longer depicted perfect gods, but living people, caught in moments of passion and struggle. The Hellenistic artists sought not only to glorify beauty, but to capture the essence of life itself: joy, pain, triumph, and despair. It was as if Alexander's own restless energy had infused their art, pushing them to reach beyond perfection towards something truer. In warfare, his influence was no less profound. Alexander's campaigns had transformed the art of battle. His use of the Macedonian phalanx, combined with swift cavalry maneuvers and relentless strategy, became a model for future generals. His ability to adapt, to fight in mountains, deserts, and jungles, inspired military thinkers for generations. Even centuries later, commanders from Hannibal to Napoleon would study his battles, seeking to uncover the secret of his genius. But Alexander's greatest legacy was not merely in weapons or empires. It was in ideas. Before him, the world had been divided into tribes, kingdoms, and races, each believing itself superior to the rest. But Alexander dreamed of something larger, a world united under a common identity, where Greek and barbarian East and West could live as one people. Though his methods were forged in conquest, his vision transcended war. He encouraged intermarriage, exchange, and understanding between cultures. He wore Persian robes, honored Egyptian gods, and respected Indian philosophers. In a time when men saw difference as weakness, he saw it as strength. The fusion of cultures he set in motion gave birth to new sciences, new art, and new philosophies, ideas that would later shape Rome, Byzantium, and even the foundations of modern thought. His empire may have fallen apart, but the Hellenistic age that followed became one of the most fertile periods in human history. Knowledge spread from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to India. Trade routes flourished, carrying not only goods but ideas. The seeds Alexander planted would bloom for centuries, and while his successors fought for his throne, poets and historians began to shape his legend. Stories of Alexander spread far beyond the lands he had conquered. In Egypt, he was worshipped as the son of Amun, the god of the sun. In Persia, he was remembered as Iskandar, a warrior of divine fate. In India, he appeared in ancient tales as a visitor from the west, blessed by the gods. Over the centuries, these stories intertwined and evolved. In Greek manuscripts, Persian epics, Arabic legends, and even medieval romances, Alexander lived again as conqueror, philosopher, explorer, and sometimes prophet. The Alexander romance, written centuries after his death, turned him into a figure of myth, crossing oceans, meeting monsters, and seeking the fountain of youth. In every culture, he became a mirror reflecting the values and dreams of those who told his story. To the Greeks, he was the embodiment of heroism, a new Achilles, born to achieve eternal glory. To the Persians, he was a divine instrument of destiny. To medieval Europe, he was the model of chivalric kingship, brave and noble. To the Islamic world, he was Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, a righteous ruler who journeyed to the ends of the earth. No conqueror in history has inspired such enduring fascination. Empires rose and fell, yet the name Alexander the Great remained. Even when his cities crumbled, his legend endured. Retold in temples, manuscripts, and songs, his influence stretched into the centuries that followed. The Roman generals who later conquered the Mediterranean saw themselves as his heirs. Julius Caesar wept, it is said, when he looked upon a statue of Alexander, lamenting that by the same age he had achieved nothing in comparison. The Romans adopted Greek culture as their own, spreading it still further, ensuring that Alexander's dream of a connected world never truly died. Even as time moved forward and empires changed hands, his image continued to evolve. During the Renaissance, artists painted him as the perfect human form, the ultimate symbol of ambition and intellect. During the Enlightenment, philosophers admired him as a visionary who had seen the unity of mankind long before others could imagine it. In modern times, historians still debate his motives. Was he a tyrant driven by ego, or a genius driven by destiny? Yet even in disagreement, all acknowledge his unparalleled impact. More than 2,000 years have passed since his death, but Alexander remains one of the most written-about figures in all of history. Every era has rediscovered him anew, because his story speaks to something timeless in the human soul. The hunger to go beyond limits, to see what lies beyond the horizon. He was not perfect. His conquests brought destruction as well as enlightenment. His ambition often overshadowed mercy. Yet through all his flaws, one truth endures. He changed the course of human history in a single lifetime. When we speak of the spread of knowledge, of cultural exchange, of the blending of civilizations, we are still living in the shadow of what he began. His world, the Hellenistic world, laid the foundations for art, science, and philosophy that would define Western civilization for millennia. The very concepts of cosmopolitanism, global citizenship, and unity in diversity trace their roots to the empire of a young Macedonian king who refused to believe in boundaries, and perhaps that is why his legend remains immortal. For Alexander was not only a conqueror of lands, but of possibilities. He showed the world that human potential could reach beyond what was thought possible, that courage and curiosity could shape the destiny of nations. In every age, there are those who look upon the vast unknown and feel the same fire that once burned in him, the desire to explore, to create, to achieve greatness, not for glory alone, but to leave a mark upon the world. Alexander's empire has long vanished. His generals and soldiers are dust, his cities worn by time. But his spirit lives on, in every library, every academy, every culture that values discovery and learning. His dream of unity still whispers in the heart of humanity, a reminder that though we are divided by language, color, and creed, we share the same endless sky. And so, His story does not end in Babylon or Alexandria. It continues in us, in every human being who dares to dream beyond their limits. Alexander once stood at the edge of the known world and wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. Yet perhaps he was wrong. The true conquest, the one that endures, is not over land, but over ignorance, fear, and time itself. And in that sense, the boy born in Pella over 2,000 years ago still lives. His legend marches on, eternal, unyielding, and immortal.